levels. 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 But yeah, I can text him and have him turn it back on. Levels. Check. Check. All right, so you can just throw that in your pocket. Okay. Throw it in your pocket. Yeah, or like back pocket, or you can clip it to your belt pocket. However you want to do that. Those clips are kind of tough, so. You want to get for it? Sure, yeah. Great, thanks. Okay. Are you okay with that? Tired. Okay. I shouldn't say anything bad from here on out. Don't say anything bad, yeah. All right. We'll
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome.
There's no mic.
Thank you for coming. My name is Paolo Carrozza. I'm a professor here in the law school, so I welcome you also into the law school, since most of you are not, are from elsewhere on campus or even from elsewhere in the community. So glad that you could come for this wonderful lecture. I'm happy to welcome you here on behalf of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. And very excited about this particular lecture, which I've been looking forward to for much of the year. You'll hear a more extensive introduction of our guest today in a moment, but I will say that Antón Barba-Kay's book, A Web of Our Own Making, which you'll see outside, is what first attracted me to him and to his work. Given my own work in the area in these days, and I will say just flat out, I think it's probably the best book on the internet and society and culture that I have read yet, period. So really looking forward to this. But to tell you more about our guest, I'd rather, following the custom of the CCCG, allow one of our students to come up and do the introduction to him. Anna Chang is a junior at Notre Dame. She's currently a Tocqueville Fellow at the Center, and she's originally from Long Island, New York. She's a stamp scholar here and studies finance and art history. So Anna, please welcome and come up to introduce our guest for us.
Antón Barba-Kay is a distinguished fellow at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. He is also senior fellow at the Institute for Practical Ethics at UC San Diego. He was formerly an associate professor of philosophy at Catholic University and Robert Aird Chair of Humanities at Deep Springs College. In addition to his scholarly publications in 19th-century German philosophy, his essays about culture and technology have appeared in The New Republic, The Hedgehog Review, and The Point, among other magazines. A Web of Our Own Making, his book about what the internet is and what a difference it makes, was published in 2023 by Cambridge University Press. He earned BAs at St. John's College and the University of Cambridge, as well as a PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. His lecture today is entitled Regimes of Speech, the Politics of AI, and the Fate of Liberal Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Antón Barba-Kay.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the Center on Citizenship and to Paolo and Anna for having me. I really am grateful to be here. And I taught for 7 years at the Catholic University of America. And so I feel like I'm in a very familiar place. I will say the signage is very superior at Notre Dame than it is there. So I feel at home even though I've never been here before. I warn you that this is a completely analog presentation. So I'm going to stand here and you will see if you can stand it for about 45 minutes. And this is partly because I'm an analog kind of guy and partly by design, as it's about the content of the talk itself. So you can see, you can check your own attention throughout. So I was on a phone call a few weeks ago with a senior researcher at Microsoft who stated matter-of-factly that the question of TikTok's ownership was more momentous to the fate of American democracy than the mobbing of the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And his argument was that the latter was a circumscribed event, while the enforced sale of TikTok will put the eyeballs of 170 million American users under the control of one of the 2 or 3 bidders already wealthy enough to buy it, such as the richest Musk in the world. Now, I saw the point of this and find it very grim, not because Mr. Musk has too many conflicts of interest to be a benign presence in government, nor even because he has shown a nakedly partisan approach to his other social media platform, but because I find it dismaying that American democracy should occur in the same sentence with TikTok, let alone be identified with it. If the fate of American democracy can be thought to hang on the ownership of TikTok, then maybe the towel has already been thrown in. Now, it's a little more complicated than this, and I realize that it's uncool of me to knock TikTok because I'm old and it costs me nothing. But one of the unshakable truisms of the digital age is that digital services and platforms are, or could, or might be in some sense democratic, or that the internet as a whole is promising for democracy. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to think through the truth of that truism. What hath TikTok, or our current digital environment as a whole, to do with democracy? Nothing much or nothing good. At least that's what I'm going to argue today. I also acknowledge that we are in an irretrievably digital situation. And so, while techno-pessimist is not the worst name I've ever been called, I promise to observe the convention of ending on an upbeat note. And if I spend most of my time trying to characterize the problem, though, it's because I think that the right answers can only be formulated to problems rightly fathomed. So let me begin by trying to conjure into view the basics of two large questions that would deserve a much more thorough explanation than I can give them here. The question of what media have to do with political regimes, and then the question of how to think about what counts as democratic, per se. So first then, why should we imagine that media technologies might have anything to do with political types, like monarchy, republic, or democracy? It's hard to make this notion plausible, partly because it's obvious that the same media can accommodate all kinds of regimes. There are digital monarchies now, just as there have been fairly illiterate democracies in the past. Yet media scholars since Lewis Mumford have argued that while media do not determine political forms, there are nonetheless affinities and resonances at work. The relationship between media and regime is not controlling or monocausal, but directive or teleological. It is about the tendency of qualitative long-term selective pressures. And just as there are media and machines that tend to standardize, displace, and diminish individual agency in ways that are difficult for any one central authority to foresee or control, so while all such tools can be used for many purposes, it's not a stretch to say that products like Apple's and Tesla's, which have proprietary control over their own parts and repairs, are relatively authoritarian, whereas highly adaptable open source programs like Linux are relatively democratic. Now, if we zoom out to a panoramic application of this insight, I think many such affinities become visible. It's clear that what we call empires, politically consolidated control over heterogeneous groups, are dependent on establishing monopolies over the technology of writing. The earliest extant examples of the written word, and these are Sumerian cuneiform documents from the early 4th millennium BC, are administrative and dynastic records, such as were produced by priestly caste to tax, survey, and conscript. No empire has ever been based on word of mouth alone. So too, what we call totalitarianism, a state of mutual surveillance in which terror, signaling, and mobilization are the norm, is only possible within a technological situation in which data about individual identities can be mechanically documented, codified, and transmitted at the speed of electricity. No pre-modern tribe could be totalitarian in this sense. And so too, what we call liberal democracy, a regime characterized by free press, collective deliberation, and a formal distinction between private and public, could only be developed within a context in which printed matter was available to a wide literate audience. A document that opens with "we the people" is predicated on its public legibility. So this point can be summed up as follows. If political communities rely on specific forms of communication to remain stable, coherent, and organized, if their viability implies an ideal relationship between information, authority, and audience, say, we can ask whether the introduction of any new medium is consonant or dissonant with them. Now, this is of course complicated by the fact that old media still exist alongside new media. We still have books, TV, and the radio. But as a new medium takes on the predominant weight of discourse, as it saturates an information environment, as people internalize its tempo and learn it by heart, the question may nonetheless be asked whether this emergent logic of uses is entropic or negentropic with respect to some given political form. And if entropic, what kinds of adaptations will have to take place if the form hopes to survive? Whatever else, it's worth noting that major media watersheds, like the transition from writing to printing, have been associated with major ruptures, such as the transition from prehistory into history, or from pre-modernity into modernity via the Reformation. I think the current conflict between Doge, which is the organ of American government most keyed to digital norms, and the judicial branch, the organ most keyed to the norms of printed literacy, is a premonition of just such another rupture. Now let me now raise the question of what media might be good for democracy. This line of inquiry is vexed by the fact that the status of democracy is itself a normative one. Beyond the very loose principle that democratic rule should be accountable and open to some critical mass of its citizens, there is no other uncontroversial definition of it. This means that there's some chance that, like life, liberty, and love, democracy has only ever been incompletely realized, that it is only present by degrees. It also means that there may be regimes that regard themselves as democratic but aren't. I note that nations with the adjective democratic in their official names tend to have mixed records. It's like, you know, a restaurant that says authentic something something. Democracy is perhaps singularly opaque in that it is singularly self-determining. The question of what it is cannot be separated from the questions of how it speaks and thinks about itself. Now, it's fairly obvious why the digital sphere was initially experienced as democratic. The usual story is one of disintermediation. Whereas up until the 1990s, any given citizen would have had to go through filters to widely disseminate a printed message, every human being with an internet connection is now in the position to broadcast footage and verbiage within a few strokes. And whereas a newspaper or television channel is a distinct source of authorized and authoritative messages, the web is, by comparison, a system of nodes, all of which are in principle connected to each other, and in which every message thereby has the potential for amplification, contagion, and resonance. Earlier media environments were relatively hierarchical or vertical. Digital services have, by comparison, a high degree of horizontality, and horizontality is supposedly democratic. Now, this stock story is not wrong, but like all triumphalist revisionism, it camouflages features of the situation. For instance, when we regard all communication as an exchange of information, this assumption betrays our own cybernetic sensibilities. It is characteristic of our digital regime that meaning is defined as content. Information is immaterial, instrumental, and shareable. It is always already useful because transmissible, and transmissible because useful. Seen in the rearview mirror, the regime of literacy looks like one in which snobs, Brahmins, and gatekeepers invidiously withheld secrets from the people. And it's easy to point to incidents that corroborate this view. But from another angle, pre-digital media environments were not only or primarily about information at all. They were about the justification and production of certain kinds of institutional authority. And now that it has become clear that the very shareability of digital data decontextualizes and disintegrates established contexts of democratic authority too, its horizontal character looks less obviously democratic. The initial giddiness around the internet's democratic promise was also experienced against the backdrop of the previous media environment. So when bloggers took down CBS news anchor and sacred cow Dan Rather in 2005, when a candid recording of Virginia Senator George Allen forced him to end his campaign in 2006, when Howard Dean and Barack Obama figured out how to crowdfund their campaigns, and when social media laid waste to autocrats in the Arab Spring of the early 2010s, these seem like democratic knockouts. By contrast, we're so many iterations into our digital milieu now that no one would be taken down by similar reveals. Nor does the fact that it is not big money but big attention that wins elections seem like an unequivocally good thing. Nor does it seem like social media is intrinsically democratic anymore. What happened? Now, new tools and new media initially present themselves as enhancements before they become replacements. An enhancement means the same thing but better. So to highly literate people, LLMs, email, and the search function are superpowers. But once an enhancement becomes the rule, what once was want becomes a need. And the new technological capacity, once internalized, transforms the conditions under which it is used, undermining the very capacities that once made it useful. So this slide from enhancement to replacement happens gradually, unevenly, and inconspicuously. Between the 1990s and the mid-2010s, and to some extent still now, we were and are amphibious creatures living both in the past and the future. Everything is still sort of the same. We still vote, we still read, we still live in nation states, but everything is also sort of other. Digital expectations about participation, optimization, and neutrality continue to chemically act on and react against the older attitudes that once served to consolidate shared forms of meaning. This is a maximally confusing situation in which many of our institutions are falling between two stools. In some ways, it recalls the Protestant Reformation, as I've said, in which the reconfiguration of people's relationship to the spiritual or virtual world compelled a wholesale reordering of political forms within the terrestrial one. And this means that we're still working out in practice the question of whether there can be a digital democracy and why we should care to have one. Now, most discussions of digital democracy presume, as I've mentioned, a confrontation between the vertical boss man and the horizontal people. What this dichotomy misses is that the character of these figures has qualitatively changed, as well as the nature of their relationships. Like all legitimate regimes, democracies live by norms, by which I mean the kind of shared expectation that goes unsaid in order to make communication possible. And this includes very obvious expectations, such as Senator Fetterman's wardrobe, and whether transfers of power are peaceful. It also includes threads of social tapestry like what people feel they can get away with, and how far is too far, and where we draw the line. At the deepest level, however, norms are forms of communal responsiveness, and the deterioration of democratic practices and institutions during the past 20 years has revealed the degree to which democracy relies on a moral infrastructure of habits, rapports, and dispositions toward the word. Because our trajectory so far has largely been one in which democratic norms have been progressively numbed and burned out by our information environment, even as we then rail on social media about the evil of these days, which, is a little like protesting climate change from the back of a pickup truck. I can't tell you how many talks I've given about the problem of digital attention to audiences that nod along in complete agreement, even as they scroll through their feeds. The fate of democracy requires that we try to articulate what the moral infrastructure of this democracy is, how digital practices bear on it, and how these practices can be ultimately harmonized with it. So in order to bring these lines of thought into focus, I'd now like to describe 3 digital pressures that seem to me to abrade democratic norms. 3 ways in which digital technology has been justified, and even justified as a democratic force, but that are in fact working against it by reforming our understanding of what we are and how we communicate. So the 3 things that I want to talk about are choice, optimization, and neutrality. I pick these because the digital temptation to conflate choice with agency, optimization with judgment, and neutrality with truth especially illuminates the difference between digital and literate democratic norms. But these conflations only work to the extent that we tend to equate what is democratic with what is egalitarian. And it is an article of digital faith that democracy and egalitarianism are synonymous. Yet egalitarianism is a property both of democracy and of certain kinds of autocracy. Everything depends on our resisting this equation. Let me first turn to the value placed on choice. I mean the casual chestnut that increasing the scope and accessibility of choice is good and per se democratic, such that Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok might be called democratic platforms because everyone gets a vote and anyone can become someone. In fact, there's nothing intrinsically democratic about participation as such. Do you think that the United States would become more democratic if people could weigh in more often? Show me your hand. See what I did there? Thank you. Would this be a better democracy if more or all government decisions were made by eliciting and consulting popular opinion? Experiments in direct democracy, both digital and analog, have become more common throughout the world over the past 2 decades. Pirate parties in Europe have experimented with something called liquid democracy along these lines, though these are parties the entire platform of which is subject to referendum by its members. The 5-Star Movement in Italy made use of a platform named Rousseau to consult members in frequent online votes. And on a larger analog scale, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's the former president of Mexico, decided a number of very unorthodox matters by national referendum, such as where to build a new airport. Under his leadership, Mexico has recently enacted legislation that makes all judges elected positions. Why should we not have more of that in this country? Now, there are a few reasons why countries do not become more democratic when the people are more frequently consulted. Expertise and state secrets are part of it, as is the fact that states need to make long-term binding commitments. There's also the fact that digital consultations give undue power to the deciding platform itself. So Rousseau was abandoned in 2021 over a disagreement between the party and the owners of the software over control of the user's data. But the better reason is that when questions are placed before a mass electorate to an extent that exceeds our capacity for deliberation, there are not just diminishing returns, but a populist or oligarchic reversal. Just as in Athenian democracy, in which direct voting often meant that everything turned on how persuasive the demagogues were, in an immediate democracy, everything begins to turn on who poses the questions and when and why. What all this suggests is the basic point that mass democratic populations can be good judges of what locally touches us, but are not able to collectively pay attention to everything that doesn't, and that this is an entirely democratic situation. I mean that the will of the people is not a fact, but an artifice. It is not the input of democratic government, but the output of its codified processes. Intermediate institutions like parties, caucuses, primaries, debates, and the Electoral College were designed, in theory, to sublimate citizen passions and interests into a version more substantive than their raw expression allows. The framers of the US Constitution explicitly speak of it as a machine, a Newtonian system of bodies, springs, devices, energies, balances, and counterbalances, operating under universally observable laws. And the point of this machine is to produce the popular will by representing it. Maybe more nicely said, the Constitution is intended to be the context within which popular decision can find its most articulate expression through the medium of good government, which is why anyone in particular's claim to immediately embody the will of the people is anti-democratic. It also suggests that a version of what Cory Doctorow has called the enshittification of digital services applies to democratic processes. There is a point beyond which the intensification of involvement degrades the quality of preferences available. Beyond a certain limit, the focus on and capture of choice as such destroys the conditions of meaningful choice themselves. Not to mention the fact that on platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, participation itself functions as the product. It is part of the customer experience that is being supplied. And this is in fact how López Obrador and other populist figures use referenda, giving people low stakes and symbolic ways of feeling involved with small potatoes, like when I ask you all for a show of hands, even as power is grabbed elsewhere. So much is perhaps obvious, but part of the context of choice is the quality of democratic deliberation itself. Is an environment in which only a few opinions are voiced by influential organs more or less democratic than an environment in which everyone can post their opinion? Now, I expect that our intuitions will be more mixed about this, but however we answer, we should attend to the fact that what counts as a public opinion is itself being transformed. In a situation in which media are exclusive, it is not just that educated elites are the ones with a say, it is that opinion takes on a representative function. The work of public thinking is done by a smaller group of people and conducted at a higher level than most users are capable of. I think it's easy to forget that the Federalist Papers are a newspaper discussion. Whereas in a situation in which all are online and in which there's no sharp distinction between speaking and participating, there's a correspondingly diminished sense of what can count as a reason at all. Public opinion formally functioned, I think, like professional sports, with many spectators and few participants. There are still superb professional athletes now, but the winners of the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism are running around on the same field with Joe Rogan, Kylie Jenner, and BBQ Barba-Kay 911, just not my handle, in an open-ended variety of scrimmages. If the chief benefit of digital democracy is denunciation, its chief harm is the eradication of the difference between public opinions and takes. The single most successful digital tool for democratic deliberation, or it's called pro-social media, is a platform called Polis, which is a decentralized platform that's been used in Taiwan to consult a wide public and to help legitimize government policy goals. Polis's innovation is that it allows citizens to post comments and to up or downvote those of others in order to gradually bridge or triangulate consensus. But it does not allow them to reply to each other or to repost. This is to cut out trolling and flame wars. I think it's nonetheless telling that its success as a digital democratic process is predicated on bracketing the exchange of reasons itself as disruptive. It conducts deliberation at the expense of speech. So let me now turn to a second article of Digital Dogma that I think is crypto-authoritarian. I mean the value placed on optimization, efficiency, and streamlined processes. In particular, the place that automation has come to occupy as a paradigmatic form of arbitration. I'm primarily thinking about the pervasive application of algorithmic processes, which are at bottom technologies that externalize human judgment. Selection algorithms for credit scoring, risk assessment, child welfare, hiring, education, and penal sentencing are now widely in use, though not always openly, and widely justified on the grounds of their democratic fairness, both in the sense that they may be said to incorporate a vast database of previous human decisions, as if data points were votes, in a sense, and in the sense that they offer an ideal of impartial decision-making mechanisms. The transparency, quality, and accountability of these systems have continually come to light as inadequate in very well-documented ways. In 2018, this is my favorite example, the settings of a risk assessment algorithm used by US Immigration and Customs Enforcement to determine whether someone should be detained or released were modified so that the algorithm only ever said detain. That this grotesque farce was nonetheless maintained as a good idea is suggestive of the ideological prestige that they enjoy. What's remarkable about the recent appearance of LLMs and generative AI is that they extend this outsourcing of judgment to speech itself. LLMs, as you know, perform two related functions. They boil down an impossibly vast sea of information into coherent narrative form, and they make it easy to produce standard content instantly and in any quantity. In other words, they automate the judgments implicit in the selection of digital information as well as in the production of it. They are automatic points of view. The democratic risks and possibilities of the situation are well advertised. They make it easy to generate fake content and disinformation, but they also make it easier for average citizens to improve their civic knowledge, to lobby and petition representatives, and to generate op-ed level gab. And if it's my obligation as a humanist to tell you that this is a bad thing, I will add that if LLMs can write institutional emails, accreditation reports, and quarterly summaries, then so much the better, because no human being should have to do that. But what's even more remarkable to me about the adoption of generative AI is how completely seamless it's been, how easy the capitulation of educational institutions has been, and how readily LLMs have unmasked the fact that our average digital engagement with speech and writing is extremely mid. Now, in theory, one might think that this should mean that LLMs write mid-prose themselves, but in practice, it's much better than that. Behind the scenes, I've heard a number of professors express relief at the existence of LLMs. They make it so that students who are not good writers, that is to say, basically all students, will be able to turn in an essay that's not a dog's breakfast. Which is true in the short term, even though the slide from enhancement to replacement will end up undermining and making obsolete the capacities of professors themselves. But what is perhaps most alarming about this transition is the fundamental refiguring of the relationship between people, words, and meaning. The First Amendment of the US Bill of Rights implies a specific anthropology of liberal democratic privacy, wherein what is fundamental about us is implicitly defined as our right to uphold our ultimate metaphysical convictions, to freely speak, to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for redress. These four rights are concentric, overlapping, and inseparable aspects of our personality, which is defined as expressive through speech. Our dignity as people consists in being able to give our word. Now, I know that speech means more than words alone, but in a situation in which AI is either a dominant generator or prop for shared words, then the long-standing definition that people are political animals possessed of speech can't but become even less true. That is, when words are disembedded from context, quantitatively generated, and put into circulation in their own right, their expressive function bleeds further into the purely instrumental. Words do and will act more and more like currency. And in such a situation, it is human beings ourselves that will be further transacted. LLMs will grease the ecstatic flow of information in such a way as to continually reveal the ways in which human thinking is itself imprecise, inefficient, and inadequate to our media environment. 9 out of 10 times, I confess to you that I would rather deal with an automated customer service representative than with a human blockhead. AI at least must meet explainability benchmarks, but no such standard exists for human denseness. And the same is happening to my own expectations about democratic deliberation itself, which is extremely inefficient and annoying by comparison to digital processes. Now, generative and other forms of AI are about to become an inseparable feature of public agency in ways that will continue to ironize it to contempt. Ukraine and Oman have AI avatars that provide political updates, like by the state. Venezuela has AI journalists on both sides for different reasons. And AI candidates have run for political office in Japan and the UK already. There's an Italian newspaper that's publishing entirely AI-generated content, headlines and all. There are AI influencers, and AROC became the first AI millionaire last year. Anthropic has developed an AI program that can actually control one's cursor and type text. The achievement of general AI, which is defined as a program that can perform cognitive digital tasks as well as any human, seems to be imminent. The CEO of Anthropic has 2 weeks ago said that in 3 to 6 months, AI will be writing 90% of all software code. Now, I'm not saying that AI will replace human agency. I think it's clear that human work will still oversee and be overseen by AI. I'm saying that AI programs are making themselves indistinguishable from human agency in such a way as to make the distinction practically irrelevant, and that this represents a fundamental departure from the principle that human beings should be taken at their word in a free and democratic society. Now, there's a third digital assumption, the perniciousness of which is harder to unearth. I mean the identification of reason with data and quasi-scientific objectivity. I'm thinking now of an assortment of phenomena such as the following: the presumption that political disagreement can be primarily resolved by fact-checking, the lazy discrediting of sources as biased, and the sanctimonious moralism that attaches to the phrases data-driven, evidence-based, and studies show. Here's some recent examples of our love of metrics that I've collected from major newspapers. Studies show that it's better for you to have friends. Studies show that social activism is good for young people. Studies show that you can save your marriage by paying others to do housework for you. And studies show that gratitude is good for you. Jonathan Haidt suggests that the wisdom of religious traditions is worth taking up because studies show that it improves our well-being. You know, one can only imagine the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob breathing a sigh of relief. Now, my complaint here is not against empiricism, but against the presumption that data should count as dispositive in questions that are ultimately moral, ethical, religious, aesthetic, or political, a presumption that is at once a cause and effect of the destruction of our public sphere. In the absence of other forms of shared experience, it perhaps makes sense that we should have turned to data as the last lingua franca. But not only has it not been able to perform this role, it has actually poured gasoline on the cynicism and polarization it was supposed to remedy. Part of the political bizarreness of our time comes from the fact that the possibility of data's neutrality is as such rarely disputed. What is impugned is the bias or fakeness in the source. Data is paired with other data rather than with something different in kind. Now, the turn to data as democratic arbiter was central to the justification of big tech in the early 2000s. Here are the words of its last major proponent, presidential candidate Barack Obama, speaking to Google HQ in 2007, quote, "The American people, they're just misinformed, or they're too busy. They're trying to get their kids to school. They're working. They just don't have enough information, or they're not professionals at sorting out all the information that's out there. And so our political process gets skewed. But if you give them good information, their instincts are good, and they will make good decisions. I am a big believer in reason and facts and evidence and science. I want people in technology. I want innovators and engineers and scientists like yourselves. I want you helping us make policy based on facts, based on reason," end quote. And as in a fairy tale, this has now come true. Yet just under 20 years later, these sentiments seem to me approximately as remote as the writings of Voltaire. And while it was possible for many of us to hew to them so long as their associated flaws were circumscribed to this or that platform, the underlying ideology of techno-optimism has suddenly emerged in much more destabilizing, neo-reactionary, and anti-democratic form. Whatever else, this serves us with an opportunity for articulating how these new avatars of tech bro authoritarianism are implied in our digital practices. Now, this is part of a much larger project, but I'd briefly single out the prejudice that technology is neutral. The notion that our means of quantification, our devices, our data-centric ways of thinking through and analyzing human problems may be used equally for good or ill. Now, whole subfields of media and critical studies exist to flog this dead horse, demonstrating that the form in which information is encoded ends up meaningfully bearing on how it is used. But it nonetheless continues to operate as the chief justification for unbridled technological progress. This is because the conviction that technology is neutral is not itself neutral. It paradoxically functions as the conviction that this neutrality is a good thing, so as to positively sanction the technological development of more neutral tools. So just as we've accepted the idea that what is non-partisan is above partisan loyalty, that what is scientific is above politics, and that the data-driven is above the human, as digital users, we have likewise a pervasive conviction in the benevolence of neutrality, in the open-ended desirability of techniques for multiplying, validating, and mediating human desires. Such a project, by implying that what is true and reasonable can only be conceived in terms of empirical metrics, is antithetical to the idea that public deliberation is itself internal to the democratic good. Data-driven process is that against which other processes are being defined as arbitrary, that is, as capricious. Yet the word arbitrary signifies what is at the discretion of an arbiter, and data has become our paradigmatic arbiter precisely by divesting itself of the impression that anyone is doing any arbitrating at all. So dataism has not simply not been able to do what we have asked of it, it has succeeded in entrenching deep suspicions about the point of politics itself. And a politics that refuses to acknowledge the need for politics is necessarily authoritarian. Now, the prospects of liberal democracy as practiced over the past couple of centuries are not very good right now, in part because the springs of its resilience have been bent out of shape by the digital pressures I've just described, in part because we don't quite understand what we're doing. The earlier liberal democratic regime was embedded within the epistemic norms of printed context. It cultivated the presence of coherent, consecutive, and consequential reasoning, as well as within a broader Enlightenment vision wherein human beings make up their own minds and put them into practice. Along with many other changes, the implicit principles of our current digital regime are reorienting our sense of what it is to be a person away from capacities like speech, judgment, and reason, and toward a merely biological and invariant understanding of our identities. And as digital tools become more powerful, human participation comes to seem more like an undesirable inefficiency. These shifts have reaching political and anthropological implications, since they bear on the question of how we are meaningfully related to others and how we all add up into the political form we have called democracy. If we think that democracy is worth defending, then it is not on account of its neutrality, but because we are called on to uphold its vision of the good we have in common. Now, people on the left tend to be extremely freaked out by the threat of fascism, just as people on the right are set off by the threat of Marxist collectivization. And I'm not saying there's zero merit to these threats, but I think that they're fixated on analog dangers of outright violence or illegality. Even setting aside the larger concern about the long-term viability of the United States as a nation state under digital conditions, I think that we are not worried enough about the immediate danger of TikTokocracy, a democracy so trivialized and hollowed out into entertaining spasms of opinion as to become indistinguishable from new forms of authoritarianism. The project of 20th century authoritarianism was to establish an Orwellian monopoly over the production of truth. For example, when Lavrenti Beria, this was Stalin's head of secret police, was disgraced and executed in 1953, everyone who owned a set of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia received a letter instructing them to cut out the entry on Beria and to replace it with a new section on the Bering Strait. The project of 21st century autocracy, by contrast, is to establish a digital monopoly over the production of what philosopher Harry Frankfurt called bullshit. In other words, speech that is careless about whether it happens to be true or false at all. China and Russia, which are the two autocracies that have most skillfully managed domestic public opinion in the digital sphere, have done so not primarily by controlling which information their populations have access to, though they do some of that too, but by at once improving user engagement and sponsoring a torrent of polarizing, distracting, irrelevant content in such a way as to destroy the conditions of concerted discussion and response. As this kind of threat is qualitative and more difficult to establish than the fascist one, it's arguably more insidious. So TikTokocracy can only be warded off by democratic moral infrastructure, and such infrastructure is only a matter of time, which is exactly what we don't have. Whereas cultivating democratic citizenship is like growing a bonsai tree, the patience of generations, our digital participation is like growing dandelions. Not only does it happen on its own, but they must be kept in check every day. Because of this gross mismatch between what's happening today and what should be happening in general, there is an urgent need for suggestions that might improve our predicaments here and now. And this requires acknowledging that we find ourselves collectively at a place where two democratic trajectories diverge. The first road runs toward the best possible version of digital democracy. This project primarily entails the zealous management, programming, and fine-tuning of our information environment, such as to make most people's online engagement as reasonable and salutary as possible. In other words, to try to solve for democracy by engineering the best conditions under which users participate and think. This might include initiatives like labeling disinformation or instituting programs of digital literacy and public education, creating bridging algorithms or pro-social media, so embedding them with algorithms that expose people to information that they don't already agree with, or designing friction-in digital products that require people to wait a few minutes before posting, and so on. The vast majority of resources being allocated to democratic initiatives already take this form. The strength of this road is that it accepts our digital situation as is and can be implemented at large scale with measurable success. It is admittedly less inspiring than richer forms of democratic life, but as the second best road, it's perhaps the road of realism. The weakness of this road is that in focusing on process, techniques, and services, it does not acknowledge the wholesale anthropological transformation away from democracy that it entails. As with Taiwan's polis, users will no longer engage in rational deliberation. Rather, our opinions will be assumed to be givens of our identity with the aim of minimizing the most destructive consequences. The implementation of most such projects not only accepts that social media platforms have an obligation to socially engineer public opinion, they also require the tacit presence of political legitimacy that no single platform or nation state now enjoys. In these and other ways, this road might not fundamentally challenge our trajectory, and I think is therefore in kind with the problems. At best, these initiatives are more like democratic weed killer than like fertilizer. At worst, they obfuscate the distinction between democracy and TikTokocracy altogether. The second road is to go back for the future. That is, to commit to long-term projects of holistic, wholesale, and post-digital education in literacy. That is, it requires acknowledgement that the actual project of fertilizing democracy is connected to the long-term disciplines of thought, that these must be placed in intentional opposition to our digital environment, and that they stand or fall with book learning. Books are, from this angle, the paradigmatic democratic technology. Like Linux, literacy requires a basic standard of competence that embeds speech, consolidates certain rhythms of discussion, and sustains abiding norms. It improves the quality of participation through a shared capacity, rather than by removing the expectation of one. This project of literate education is not simply about reading words, but about creating the conditions under which democratic deliberation, justification, and attention as habitual casts of mind might be possible. So I'm not thinking just of an education without internet, but one in which our digital involvement is much more aggressively specified, disambiguated, and firewalled off from the practices of literacy. If, as I've argued, the optimum use of information technology is reliant on the presence of literacy, then the space for the latter's possibility should be jealously protected up through undergraduate education. But such an education should make plain that the project of a literate education is not just a way of processing information, but one in which the attention to and the legibility of the material and political world are more broadly at stake. So in addition to things like long-form reading, writing, and discussion, I think it should introduce students to the disciplines of craft and work, which might mean boat building, as well as gardening or learning how to code and hack. It would need, in other words, to provide students with practical experience in the democratic principles that it purports to maintain. And such post-digital humanism will require establishing a total atmosphere of attentional demands to rival the compelling and immersive experiences on offer in the digital one, which is by no means a given. Now, the weakness of this second road is its patent unrealism. The United States is already well on the way to becoming an illiterate country. While the quality of literacy is notoriously tricky to quantify, data suggests that growing numbers of American adults, about half in total, have low literacy levels, which is worse than about half of the other OECD countries measured. The point is not that people cannot read text, but that our benchmarks for functional literacy have long been losing touch with the capacity to think in or follow the units of narrative meaning we call essays, novels, books, political movements, and nation states. Is it possible to reverse this degradation? However you wish to answer, it's plain that the cardinal difference between the first and the second road centers on whether we think that democracy depends on the presence of meaningful and high-quality public speech, and that our current trajectory is made so much the worse by the fact that we refuse to acknowledge the rupture happening at our digital fingertips. I guess my own answer about which road is best is obvious enough. If a national discussion is not exactly possible now, I think that the seeds of one are still present in specific settings of people stake to thought in common. And if this educational program is not the most realistic option, I think it remains the most practical. That is, the most harmonious with the latent hopes of a democracy that's still young and still to be achieved. That's it. Thank you very much for listening for 45 minutes. You did great.
Everybody sat there 45 minutes.
Yeah, no, amazing.
I can get a quick mic on me so I can, sure. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Antón. That's really, so we have someone who's with a mic, a student who can bring a mic around for questions. We have about 20 minutes available. For those of you who can't stay to the end or are going to slip out, let me make the announcement right now that on your way out, feel free to grab one of the books there of Web for Our Own Making. Those are free for your taking, thanks to the center, as well as an extra lunch if you want. There are plenty still out there. Have a second lunch, have an early dinner. So thank you for coming, and questions, comments, challenges, provocations. Let's start in the back row, please.
Hey, so thank you very much. I was just wondering, you were talking at the end about how use of AI, use of social media is sort of detrimenting our ability to become a community of society and function cohesively. I was just wondering, what are some personal steps you think we can take as individuals, rather than as a society as a whole, but just help improve ourselves to try to limit the effects of social media and AI on our lives?
Yeah, that's always the first question I get. But it's an excellent one. I mean, I don't have anything to add that's different in kind from what you know. So, I think anything you do, whether it's, let's say, trying to learn about current events not in social media or digital form, or, I think opting out of social media altogether would be a good idea for all of us, or opting out of, the worst forms of it. I mean, I acknowledge that this is complicated because it's a collective action problem. So there's a way in which there are many steps that you could take as an individual that, like, the only result of which would be to make your life very annoying and, like, difficult, right? So because the problem isn't situated anywhere in particular, right? It's like both it's in families, it's in schools, it's in universities, it's in, how the news is produced. Then, it's difficult to say, like, what in particular would cause some critical mass of things to happen. But I think, okay, if I could make up something on the spot, I would just say maybe we choose not to pay attention to all of the news, but we follow, like, a few stories in much greater depth than we've been doing. Like, we pay attention to what happens over 6 months of time and see whether that makes any difference to the way in which, you relate to what others are saying about it.
So good, thank you very much.
You forced me to come up with a
There was another hand still in the back row. Let's stay there.
Yeah, thank you for being here. That was wonderful. I think since the 2016 election in particular, I've been really curious about the prevalence of these terms misinformation and disinformation? Because it seems like when I was growing up, you know, we had lies and truth, or we had fibs or falsities, but it seems to me that there's been this evolution to these terms that are a bit more like morally sanitized. And I wonder if that gets to this shift towards obsession with data and like using this scientific terminology to refer to actions or immoral things that, you know, traditionally were covered through a more philosophical or theological framework. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, sorry, I'm stumped for the moment. One of the two, disinformation or misinformation, I think disinformation has a more technical meaning, which is information that has, you know, kind of like demonstrably been like faked for the purposes of producing like a lot of attention.
There's an intentionality behind it.
That's right, that's right. I mean, so in some cases, I don't know in how many, but in some cases it's possible to show that someone is sitting in their basement, like coming up with stuff that then gets a lot of traction. So that's what I think disinformation.
Yeah,
right.
right.
But I mean, you're right that the kind of mainstream obsession with labeling mis and disinformation is like has become a highly political project, right? Because there are, I mean, Paolo can speak to this better than I can, but there are like zones of grayness where it's like, well, you have to choose what sources to count as authoritative, and often your selection of those sources, you know, relies on certain kinds of assumptions about like how you want to live your life. And so I think that, right, that's a great example of the way in which over-focusing on data as such has been very politically damaging, because it's a way of like, in some cases, refusing to acknowledge that there is like a difference in orientation or in political conviction that's at work.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I'm curious, why do you think we even felt the need to have new terms like this in the first place? I mean, why not just call a lie and truth the truth? Why do we feel the need to say, oh, this is disinformation and misinformation? Because I think, from my perspective, it sort of lessens the impact of what you're saying about a lie, right? It's saying, oh, we throw around misinformation and disinformation so much now. It's like, why not attach the traditional moral meaning to a mistruth and call it a lie?
I mean, I think you just gave the reason, right? That there's this presumption that our vocabulary, I mean, yeah, not just for this, but I think a lot of our online vocabulary is, in some sense, amoral or supramoral, right? So, like, if you make a moral move, then it's already informed by your own biases, which is bad thing to have. But if we only speak of ourselves as, trying to think of another good example of what you're saying. I mean, I feel like in the last 10 years, there's been this proliferation of strange nouns that never existed before, like communicability or, you know, words that like don't need to exist, but that, I mean, I think, yeah, anyway, I won't get further into it, but there's some way in which when we relate to what's happening online, we always feel like we're outside of it or should be outside of it and should merely be kind of like describing what happens as if observing it. And people who speak that way have this greater credibility for the reason that, you know, we feel like neutrality is good and benevolent. But
Thank you.
it's a great example.
Right down here in the middle, please.
Thank you, Antón. This was awesome. I'm going to echo Paolo's comments, too, about your book being one of the most important about the internet in the last decade or more. So 2 words you didn't mention that I'm curious as to why, and I'll be democratic and let you just pick one and tell me, but 1 is McLuhan, and 2 is propaganda. And the second one, I'm thinking about propaganda as technique. So like Jacques Ellul talks about, And I'm wondering, because it seems like regardless of the technology, whether it's Roman papyrus and empire or a TikTokocracy, there's a technique beneath it that is rooted in some kind of propaganda method. And I think for us moderns, like Freud and Bernays would be sort of the forefathers of this kind of tapping into the psychoanalytic and using institutions and power to actually influence public opinion and debate. And so as the technologies evolve, the platform sort of becomes irrelevant. And it's just how best to implement those techniques once again under new platforms and regimes. So you don't have to take up the McLuhan one. We can talk about that later. But the propaganda one I'm really interested in.
Oh, thank you for that. I mean, in a way, it's a version of the question about misinformation, right? Because I think that the word propaganda itself operates as a kind of opposite of the disinformation characterization, right? Like, whereas we want to step outside and say, you know, this data was generated infelicitously on the one hand. On the other hand, we, or at least I think in common discourse, we'll call propaganda just either blatant falsities or forms of falsity that we think aren't true, or sorry, that we think that is opinions that we think aren't true. But I mean, I think the more interesting thing behind the comparison to the science of advertising in the earlier 20th century is, I think this was implied in what you said, that there was a kind of theory of human beings and a kind of like theory of the self and an anthropology from which people thought they could deduce ways of affecting people. Whereas, as far as I know and see, the people who produce disinformation or lies now have a kind of like effect first approach to it, right? There's not like a rich theory of how they achieve what, I mean, there's principles, but in a way they're throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and some of it is picked up and some of it isn't, but there's no, I don't know that there's, I want to dignify that by saying that there's a science on it or something.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of like, Top Gun being propaganda for military, imperial, like there's ways of making it really entertaining and not false, and that's, I think the same is true for ideology. So if I go on TikTok and I see 100 videos about these people with an activist stance having a lot of fun and doing this dance, they're not even arguing or discoursing democratically, they're just like making this view really attractive. And I think that's a propaganda technique that's doesn't fall under the sort of misinformation category. It's just the way we present ourselves to ourselves as being sort of tacit, acceptance of norms, which it's not, but yeah.
No, I mean,
Right, you can just pass that to the left, to your immediate left.
Oh, you.
I'm no, sorry, to your immediate right was where the hands, I'm sorry. My left.
Yeah, I had a question about, you talked about like how to change how we're approaching, I guess, the new media to cultivate spaces for real deliberation again. I'm wondering if you've also just thought about like the role of physical space and community, I guess, in having spaces for deliberation and like what sort of, I take your point about a need to cultivate like a certain type of deeper thinking in people through education. I think that's definitely right. But then also it seems like people just aren't interfacing as much with each other in the real world in ways where or like also, you could also think about it from the perspective of like emphasizing more local spaces of governance as opposed to governance that's so far away that it's hard to really deliberate about it. I guess I'm curious if you thought about the question in those sorts of terms, or the like spaces, like space in a real physical way, and how that plays into this, and how digital technology affects how we think about physical space.
Yeah, no, well, my life was changed by going to Deep Springs College, which is not a kind of institution that can be widely replicated, but its principle is that there's 26 students, 3 or 4 faculty members, and the students have the responsibility, the duty to, run a ranch, grow alfalfa, admit students, and hire faculty, among other things. And what was the principle that I think is powerful or formative about that is that people don't come to deliberate democratically or rationally just as a kind of leisure activity, right? It's when there's actually something at stake that people are invested in, and in a sense, like, have to be invested in, because the thing needs to be done for a collectively acknowledged reason, that people really kind of, start to do the thing that we want everyone to do. And so I don't know how to make that possible at, an institution like Notre Dame. I think, the other feature of Deep Springs is that it's free. So there's a way in which, tuition doesn't disrupt the fact of education in the way that it does elsewhere. But I think that if students could run their own dorm floors or dorms as a whole, right? Just say, like, here you go. You get to clean it. You get to manage it. You're responsible for it. I don't know. I know that itself is utopian, but I feel like it can't just be a matter of kind of like an extra study session where people, get to talk about a book. Like, there has to be something, a practical moment where people are at stake, and that's what's hard to come up with or to replicate elsewhere.
Now, sorry, I bypassed you earlier. Go ahead.
So Notre Dame just released Gemini and Notebook LM to its undergraduate students, and I'm taking classes currently that are starting to require me to use them for different assignments. So I was wondering, how would you suggest students interact with different forms of generative AI in a way that's intentional and in a practical educational setting?
Yeah, I think that it's a good idea to learn how to use them well, right? So even though I think that the fact of their presence on the whole is not good, like, given that we have it, then you will be better served by learning how to use them well. May I ask what kinds of classes require you to use it?
Class.
Class.
Yeah, it's called coding in a liberal arts context. So it's like about basically coding for liberal arts students and learning like different forms of computing with more of a humanities background.
Tell me whether this is unrealistic. I can't help but think that in 20 years, once, no one knows how to code except with an LLM, people who sort of like remember some principles of, I'm tempted to call it analog coding, but of course that's not right, like pre-LLM coding will have an advantage, right? And so I wonder whether there's some way of thinking about this distinction between enhancement and replacement, for you at this stage, where it's like, are there things that you maybe will have to do extra that would still keep you in touch with, like, what's key is the capacity to assess whether the LLM is doing something well or not, right? Like that, as long as you can make that assessment, you have an enhancement. Like, the tool is making you stronger, whereas, in a situation in which everyone just like writes this way, no one will know like whether this is good or not anymore. Like, its only benefit is that it just happens quickly and no one has to read it or think about it. So I don't know whether that is a realistic, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I think there was another hand on the same row over on this side.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. I think I was particularly heartened in the end to hear your turn to humanities education or something like it, because I tend to think that that is sort of one of the best solutions. And one of the reasons that I think that is because all of the talk of designing digital platforms in order to be, quote unquote, more democratic misses what I think is a very important problem, which is that the platforms that we're increasingly labeling as a public sphere, a new public sphere, are in fact produced by a culture which is inimical to the principles of liberal democracy, insofar as they are produced for profit by people who have a very different set of expectations about what discourse looks like and who come from a very hierarchical setting. So I was wondering, and this is sort of in reference to some of the tenuous but I think apparent connections that you were drawing between like a technological form and a given regime type at the beginning of your talk, to what extent you think it's important to level a critique and perhaps pose solutions not only to technology and a given form that it takes, but yes, like the culture behind it. And in this case, I'm thinking about something like Silicon Valley, which has produced people who have very different ideas about how a government should be run than I think a lot of the kind of preeminent theorists of the liberal democratic tradition. So I think, like, for example, you know, at the extreme end of Curtis Yarvin, who thinks that America should be run like a corporation because that's sort of the most efficient way to do things. Or even Elon Musk, who thinks that whether or not people are performing meaningful tasks at their jobs can be determined by artificial intelligence. So yeah, I wondered if you could speak to maybe some of those connections and to what extent you think that also requires some form of literacy, you know, more than just data literacy or information literacy, but yeah, what kinds of things would you maybe propose to combat that?
Sorry,
or to critique that, I guess.
That being the kind of political form of Silicon Valley companies.
Yeah, like, I mean, so maybe first, do you agree that the culture behind the technologies is just as important as the form that they take? Open question. I think it's up for debate. And then if so, how do we address that and not just kind of like the technologies themselves, basically throwing kind of ad hoc solutions at them, but trying to address something more deeply rooted?
No, that's, I mean, in a way, a more helpful formulation for what I like want the one takeaway to be from today's talk, which is that there isn't a strong distinction, I think, between, you know, the tech brotherhood and the ideology of the devices themselves. Like, I think, I mean, I haven't like proved that exactly, but I think the way in which, like, as you're pointing out, all these things like wear the word democratic, but when you look at the way in which groups of people committed to this kind of, you know, thinking and doing end up, you know, what they look like or what happens to them, it's, I mean, either they're not just like regular companies, right? If you've ever visited one, what's confounding, you know, like Google headquarters is the kind of elimination of the distinction between work and leisure, right? There's like bean bags and snacks and everyone is having an awesome time, but everyone is being like completely tracked and surveilled. So there's this like strange fusion of kind of like kindergarten and concentration camp that like epitomizes like that that form. So in a way, I'm denying that one could simply change the culture while, you know, retaining digital uses as they are. And so conversely, if we're serious about you know, what we understand as this longer liberal democratic tradition, then we just need to be like reading, writing, and thinking in terms of reading, writing a lot more. And it's not, we can't change our culture without changing what we're doing and how we're speaking to each other.
Thank you, Antón. I'm sorry that we're out of time because this could go on for much, much longer. I think we have to thank you at a minimum for two things, among many others. One is that in the context of a technology and a technological culture in which everything is ephemeral, which is at the core of a lot of what you've written and said today, you've given us a lot that will remain in terms of provoking us to continue to think about the way we act ourselves and interact with technology and with our environment and what's around us. And two, that you were quite faithful to what you said at the outset, that the form of your presentation was expressive and embodiment of exactly the substance of what you were trying to teach us. So for both those things, thank you, and thank you for everything else you said, and please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you very much.
And again, feel free to take one of the free books outside. Guarantee you won't regret it. And also another lunch if you want to have one for later.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you very much.
Really great. Will you share the text with me? Do you mind?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll keep it to myself until
Yeah,
unless, you know, whatever. But